Hello everyone. Today we're going to be learning about Exposure by Wilfred Owen from the Power and Conflict anthology, and obviously the poem Exposure is more about conflict than it is power. Obviously there are elements of power, but we're really going to be more focusing on that conflict level. We're going to be focused on the analysis and really getting into the detail of the poem. And by the end of the lesson, you should be able to respond to and offer your own interpretation of the poem's language and meaning. You should be able to analyse the structure, form and language of the poem. And you should be able to apply contextual information to develop your understanding and analysis of the poem. And that will allow you to hit all of the 3 assessment objectives in the examination that you'll take around this time next year. All right. Now, just like with last week's lesson, you're going to need to have a pen and a piece of paper handy so that you can make notes. If you don't have one of them now, press pause, go and get some and come back. You'll also need your anthology as well, so you can read a copy of the poem. All right. Now, throughout the lesson, I would expect you to hit the pause and do the tasks that are set. Some of the tasks might last 2 or 3 minutes. Some of the tasks might only last a few seconds. But you'll need to press pause in order to do them. Right. I would like you to draw an image of war. And when you're finished, you can, it says there, come to the front and stick it onto the board. But what I'd really prefer you to do is maybe even email it over to me or something like that. So if you just draw an image of war, something that makes you think of war. And we're now going to look at what these images expose. So did any of you produce an image that exposes conflict, death and destruction, sorrow, perhaps even boredom? Right? Look at the image that you've drawn again. What can you see in the image that maybe I haven't looked at? Now, the title of the poem is always a good place to start, especially when you're doing unseen poetry. Always think title, first line, last line. Right? Those are something that the poet really thinks about. Often a poet will change the title several times before he publishes the poem. And he'll revise his first and last line because he wants to start with some kind of impact and end with some kind of impact. Right? So the title's usually a good place to start when trying to make sense of poetry. In this case, the title is Exposure. I want you to write down the meanings of the word exposure. If you're not sure, that's fine. Grab a dictionary, or more likely grab your phone and Google it. But write down what you think or what you can find the meaning of exposure to be. Right. The definitions that I've found is the state of being left open and vulnerable to something damaging or harmful. The revelation of something potentially shocking. In photography, the exposure determines how light or dark an image will appear. Right, so different meanings to the word exposure. So the word exposure can be ambiguous, and here it's meant to be ambiguous. Right? The state of being left open and vulnerable to something damaging or harmful. Is he talking about the wind and the rain and the snow? Or is he talking about the enemy gunfire from the other side of the trenches? Is he mainly focusing on the revelation? What is he revealing that might be potentially shocking? Is he revealing something perhaps to the audience of the poem? Now, obviously, you have to think of the audience. He's not writing this to other soldiers. He's writing it to people at home. He's exposing what it's like to be on the front line and the true nature and reality of war. Now, some context for you. Obviously, this is set in the First World War. which took place between 1914 and 1918, and it was a watershed moment in military warfare. Modern technology was catching up to warfare, so while we might not look at this as modern warfare in terms of Call of Duty, the kind of weaponry that you have there, that's where most of you will have heard that term, but modern technology meant that the damage that opposing soldiers could inflict on each other was greater than ever before. You know, you're going back 50 or 60 years and you still got cannon fire and single shot muskets and things like that. So this modern technology was really, really catching up, and it meant that greater damage could be done than ever was before. The relatively new invention of the camera also meant that the horrors of war could be accurately recorded and exposed to the public for the first time. Right, so you can see in the two images, you've got one soldier there with a camera. He was a war photographer, if you want to put them two together. And then you've also got the machine gun there. Right? Absolutely devastating weaponry. Now, we were marooned in a foreign desert. There was not a sign of life on the horizon and 1,000 signs of death. The marvel is we did not all die of cold. That was something that Wilfred Owen said. Now, the common soldier did not possess a camera. What they did possess, however, were pens and paper. It's from letters home that we can best understand the fears and concerns of those fighting on the front line. The celebrated war poets, including Robert Graves and Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon, were simple, ordinary soldiers. They weren't out there with the job of writing poetry for war poetry. They were there as soldiers who would pick up a pen and a piece of paper and write down their thoughts and their feelings. Remember, that's what poetry is. The thoughts and feelings of the writer written down in the best language available to them. Right? So these poets were ordinary soldiers who could turn their thoughts and feelings and those of their comrades into emotive and explosive poetry that was published in newspapers and eventually collected into popular anthologies during the war and then in the years following the war. And obviously we still use them in certain anthologies that we have today, such as your GCSE anthology. Now, when the war began, it was expected to be over within months. Right? Remember, I said it was from 1914 to 1918. Right? The saying was, it'll all be over by Christmas. No one expected it to last 4 years. Right? Now, many young men enlisted thanks to the patriotic propaganda, such as Jesse Pope's poem, Who's for the Game, which depicted combat as some kind of sport, and if you didn't join in with the sport and play the game, you were a coward. Owen was different though, right? Owen, at that point, was working as a private tutor, and he signed up for the war in October 1915, so he wasn't straight in, but still quite early on. Now, in May 1917, he was hospitalised, so this is about a year and a half in to his part of the war. He was hospitalised and he suffered from shell shock. Right? Now, while he was in the hospital recuperating, it was in Craig Lockhart War Hospital in Edinburgh, and Owen met another poet who's called Siegfried Sassoon. You may remember in year 8, you looked at his poem, Suicide in the Trenches. I couldn't remember there for a second. Right. Now, a few years Owen Senior, and already established as a poet, Sassoon was instrumental in giving Owen the confidence to share his work. And in the winter of 1917, when Owen returned to the trenches, it was one of the coldest in living memory in mainland Europe. Right? So this was called for everyone, not just the people in the trenches. It was one of the coldest winters of what everyone could remember. The difference is these soldiers were stuck outside for hours on end while they were on their duty. Now, frostbite, some lovely images there to look at. I hope you're not eating while you're looking at that. Now, frostbite is when exposure to severe cold temperature causes freezing to the skin, and in extreme cases to bone, muscle and tendon, and can often end up leading to amputation. So the foot, perhaps even the leg might even need to be cut off if it spreads too quickly. Now, trench foot was a similar condition caused by prolonged exposure of the feet to cold and damp and unsanitary conditions commonly found in the trenches. And that's why it's called trench foot. So if you think about when you've been in the bath for 40 minutes or something, and you get out and the palms of your hand and the soles of your feet, they're all wrinkly because it's softened the skin. So just think, if you're in a trench and it's not like they had good drainage, so when it rained, the trenches filled up. So you could be stood on duty in that trench for 6 hours, completely drenching your feet, and it soaks into the skin, and then it's really cold on top of that. There was nothing that they could do. So many of these soldiers would get trench foot. You know, there was even cases where there would be like mice or rats nibbling on the flesh and people wouldn't even know. That's how bad it was. Now, Wilfred Owen was killed in action on the 4th of November 1918 whilst leading a party raid crossing the Sombre-Rice Canal in northern France. I apologise if I said that incorrectly. The successful seizure of the Canal Lockhouse was one of the war's final battles. Exactly 1 week later, the armistice declaring the war was signed. So look at that date at the top, right? We've got the 4th of November 1918. We always have our Remembrance Day or Armistice Day celebration on the 11th, so that's exactly a week later. Right, now, it's alleged that Owen's mother received the telegram informing her of her son's death on Armistice Day itself, at the exact time that the church bells were ringing out in celebration. So while everyone in the country is celebrating that the war is over, Wilfred Owen's mother was receiving notice that he'd been killed, and he was 25 years old. Not even really started his life. Now, most of Owen's work was published posthumously. That means after he's died. But he's widely credited as the poet who best captured the bleak and despairing tone of the war, in stark contrast to the idealistic sonnets of fellow war poet Rupert Brooke. Now, Rupert Brooke was very flowery, and he wanted to paint the picture of war being great. And, you know, in one of the poems, Rupert Brooke's The Soldier, he says, "If I should die, think only this of me, that there shall be a corner of a foreign field that will be forever England." Right, so he's trying to make it sound like, you know, it doesn't matter if I die. If I die because I'm English, I'll make somewhere else better because I'll be in the ground there, and Englishmen in the ground in Germany will make it better. Right? Wilfred Owen was completely against that kind of poetry. He wanted people to know what the war was really like. Now, one of the great techniques that Wilfred Owen uses in the poem is personification. The soldiers are exposed to brutal weather conditions, and if the enemy ranks don't kill them, then it's quite simple: the other enemy will, Mother Nature. So what I want you to do is look through your poem and find some examples of personification Remember, personification is where something is being portrayed as a person, right? So the actions of a person, the characteristics of a person, right? So find and analyze examples of personification. The impression that there are enemies all around raining down on the men adds to the poem's sense of despair and the evaporation of hope. How else is a sense of futility conveyed? If you're not sure what the word futility means, look it up. Right. Now, we've got 6 titles of other poems by Wilfred Owen. One of them being Futility, which you should have just looked up. Another, Anthem for Doomed Youth, Disabled, Spring Offensive, Insensibility, and Arms and the Boy. I want you to look carefully at these titles of the poems. If you're not sure what any of them mean, look them up. And I want you to think, what connections can you make and what themes do they indicate? So we shouldn't judge a book by its cover, but if you were to judge these poems and predict what kind of themes that they're going to be including, what would they be? Now I want you to think of exposure. Our brains ache. We've got immediate and repeated use of inclusive pronouns, which creates a sense of camaraderie. Right? So he's telling this clearly from a soldier's perspective, but he's not saying my brain aches. He's saying our brains ache. So he's speaking for everyone there. Now, what is it that's causing their brains to ache? They need to be alert. All that plays on their mind during the war, the futility of the war, is that what's causing their brains to ache? Right? So there's a clear, painful sensation. And this is a very blunt opening to the poem, which sets the tone. Straight away, we know these soldiers are suffering and they're in pain. Sorry. Now, John Keats wrote a poem called Ode to a Nightingale, where he says, "My heart aches and a drowsy numbness pains." Right, so what do you notice about that opening line? Now, Owen was an avid fan of John Keats, one of the leading romantic poets. And the romantics weren't about love and things like that. They were, but it wasn't the romantics that what we would understand romantic to be, right? The romantics believed in the grandeur and beauty of nature. And in this famous poem by Keats, heart aches with happiness as he is enchanted by the song of a nightingale. Another of Keats' poem, Ode on a Grecian Urn, concludes, "Beauty is truth, truth beauty." Right? So John Keats is a romantic. If you think of William Blake and Wordsworth, they are both romantics around the same time as John Keats. Right? But Wilfred Owen wanted truth to be out. He wanted people to know what war was like. He wanted to expose the world to the reality of war, a little bit like the war photographer. So there's a direct link there, right? But he's stolen almost so a line from John Keats, right? So where his heart ached with happiness, their brains ache. So why do their brains ache? You've got to think about that, right? So how does Owen's poem contradict his hero's ideas? Because basically, John Keats was in love with nature, whereas here, Wilfred Owen is being punished by nature. Now, the poem contains some quite clear allusions to religion. Wilfred Owen was a Christian, and I know it says "Losing My Religion." That's an REM song title there at the top. We don't really know whether he was losing his religion. I don't think he was. I've never come across anything like that. But line 9 is similar to a passage in the New Testament in Matthew chapter 24, verse 6. So line 9 says, "Far off like a dull rumour of some other war." And in Matthew it says, "You will hear wars and rumours of wars." Now, the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 24 specifically, is talking about the end of days, the apocalypse, the end of the world. Now, if you think about it, to someone like Wilfred Owen, who was a Christian and who knew the Bible quite well, he would be looking at this and probably thinking that this could be the apocalypse, the end of the world. We call it World War One because it was such a massive thing, and this could have been the end of the world to him. Right? I'd like you to read through the poem again and see if you can find any other examples of religious imagery, anywhere where you think that he's talking about Christianity. Now, in stanza 7, it suggests that soldiers might be Christ-like, or in other words, they might sacrifice themselves for the sake of others. Now, the last line of the poem is ambiguous. It's saying that Christian men will die and sacrifice themselves for the love of God, or is it saying that God has forsaken them and that it's God's love that's dying? Right, so we've got some ambiguity. So I'll just give you those two ideas. So, for love of God seems dying. Right, that's the line from the poem. So, is it saying that Christian men will sacrifice themselves for the love of God and for the rest of God's children? Or is it saying that God's love is dying and that he's not feeling God's love? So you've got some of that ambiguity. That's always a good way to look at a poem, thinking, well, it could mean this, but it could also mean this. So I want you to think for yourself. Do you think that the narrator of the poem, Exposure, is turning to or away from God? Right, I'd like you to maybe write a paragraph on that now. And don't forget this part here, give evidence to support your point of view. So you must focus on the evidence from the poem. Right, now, like I say, Wilfred Owen was a Christian, and as a young man, Owen worked as an assistant to the Vicar of Dunsdon. Right, but he became disillusioned with the practices of the church. Right, so he's a little bit like William Blake, who wrote London, where he was a Christian and believed in God, but not necessarily in organised churches and religion. Right, so take a couple of minutes now and write your paragraph as to whether he's turning to or away from God. Now, the form and structure of the poem is very specific, right? So let's look at the first stanza. Our brains ache in the merciless ice-east winds that knife us. We read, we keep awake because the night is silent. Low drooping flares confuse our memory of the salient. Worried by silence, sentries whisper, curious, nervous, but nothing happens. Right, now, remember, when you use ellipsis in your writing, it can show that when it's in creative writing rather than writing essays, it can show that someone's been interrupted. It can show that someone's pausing to think about something and there's a passage of time. I think that's what it's trying to show here. right? So I think that the ellipsis is indicating that time is passing and that there's a nervous and quite long wait, and that leads to having a lot of time to think. Now the final line is emphasized by indentation and change in rhyme scheme, though the content is anticlimactic. Right? Now it does link in, so while it's different from the rest, and it's slightly different because it's repeated throughout the poem, but nothing happens, that's a specific choice that Wilfred Owen has made. Right? Now, is there a rhyme scheme in there? So remember, it's only really a rhyme scheme if it's continued throughout the poem. So have a look and see if there is a rhyme scheme in your opinion. Right, look at the punctuation. So we've got the use of ellipsis, but we've also got worried by silence, sentries whisper, curious, nervous. And then the first full stop is the end of the stanza. Right? Why might he be doing it that way? Think about those things. Jot a couple of ideas down. Annotate the stanza in the poem if you haven't already done so. And then really have a think, why might the final line be indented? He's done it for a reason, so what is the reason? You try and figure out what that reason might be. Sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence, less deadly than the air that shudders black with snow, with sidelong flowing flakes that flock, pause and renew. We watch them wandering up and down the wind's nonchalance, but nothing happens. So we've got A, B, B, A, C. So there is that regular rhyme scheme. And this uniformity reflects the monotony of life in the trenches. They'd have the same things to do every day, day in, day out, for weeks and weeks and weeks. If they were lucky, it would be weeks and weeks and weeks. Now, on the other hand, the rhythmic structure is hexameter based. Owen does not religiously stick to it. So think if there's a certain number of syllables in each line, why would he then not stick to it religiously if there's supposed to be a certain number? So sometimes there are missed beats and sometimes there are added beats, which kind of add to the sense of discomfort and sense that something's not right here. Right? Now, if you look at the top two lines, I've underlined the S's. Right? Now, you can get away with saying it's alliteration, but sibilance is a specific type of alliteration. Right? Sibilance is the repetition of the S and the sh sound. Right? Now, here, I'm just going to read it again. Sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence, less deadly than the air that shudders black with snow. Right, now here you've got the sibilance that echoes the sound of the bullets whooshing by, or the sound of the soldiers shivering. Right? So what we've got to think about, a bullet doesn't make a bang. The gun makes the bang, and if it's 200 meters away, when the bullet flies past your head, all you hear is a s. Right? Now, if there's, just look at what the line says. So sudden successive flights of bullets. So there's lots of bullets coming one after the other, streaking the silence, but it's streaking the silence with a s, 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 s noise as the bullets whiz past their heads. Right, and hopefully don't hit them. Right, so it's a very good sound feature that Wilfred Owen's used there to bring the sound of the war in. And often we think of war as being a very loud thing, but here he's talking about silence and just gentle noises that going over their head. And I want you to think, how does Owen elsewhere make effective use of alliteration and assonance? Right, so look through the poem. What other examples of sound techniques can you spot? Now we've got comparisons of conflict, right? So if you look here, the first is the charge of the Light Brigade. Then we've got the kind of World War I exposure soldier, and then we've got much more modern warfare that you're more likely to see in Remains, right? So I want you to sum up these conflicts in 6 words. It's difficult to do that, but just give it a try. Take a couple of minutes to do that. Right, now what I want you to do is use those summaries and draw comparisons to other poems in the anthology. When I say draw comparisons, I don't mean get a pencil and a piece of paper. You can do that if you want to record and make links like a spider diagram, but not like, you don't need to draw anything like an art lesson. Right? So use your summaries to draw or make comparisons to other poems in the anthology. Right? So there's only 3 images here. Right? Sum up how conflict is presented in exposure in 6 words. Then you could try expanding that and thinking how you can draw a comparison from that summary to other poems, and maybe do a 6-word summaries of those poems and see how they fit in together. It's always important that you think about how the poems fit in with each other, right? Because in your exam, you will need to compare your given poem with another poem of your choice. So you always need to focus on making sure that you definitely know which poems compare easily with other poems. So this will hopefully help you to think, right, well, which poems does exposure link to? And it links to quite a lot. Okay, I shall see you in the next few weeks. Bye-bye.